The stars had never seemed so dark as they did on the day the Cathari came to Earth, 300 years before the events that would shake the galaxy. Humanity was a young species that had barely learned to walk among the stars, and they had no idea that death was coming for them from the void between worlds. The Cathari Dominion arrived without warning and without mercy, and their warships filled the skies of Earth like a plague of metal locusts, and their weapons turned cities into ash and oceans into steam, and in 72 hours 4 billion humans died. Screaming Commander Lena Morris stood on the bridge of her crippled destroyer, the Valiant, and watched the world burn beneath her. And she was 29 years old, and she had joined the Navy to explore the stars, and now she was watching her species die. Commander, a communications officer said with a voice that trembled like a leaf in a storm, "We are receiving reports from every continent, and the death toll is beyond calculation, and our defense grid has completely failed." Lena gripped the railing of her command station so hard that her knuckles turned white, and she had 17 ships under her command, and they were all that remained of Earth's orbital defense fleet, and against the Cathari Armada they were nothing more than insects waiting to be crushed. "All ships form up on my position," she ordered, and her voice was steady even though her heart was breaking. "We will make them pay for every human life they have taken, and we will die with honor." Her ships moved into formation, and they were battered and bleeding and running on emergency power, but they moved anyway because that was what humans did, and they faced the enemy and prepared to die. The Cathari noticed them the way a giant might notice an ant, and a dozen warships broke away from the main fleet and moved to destroy the last remnants of human resistance. And Lena watched them come, and she thought about her mother in Seattle and her brother in Tokyo, and she wondered if they were still alive then. The sky changed. It happened in an instant, in one moment. The stars were empty, and the next moment they were filled with ships, and these new vessels were unlike anything Lena had ever seen, and they were vast and ancient and beautiful in a way that made her soul ache. The Cathari had no time to react, and the new ships opened fire with weapons that seemed to bend light itself, and Cathari warships exploded in cascades of golden flame, and in 30 seconds the attack squadron was gone. Lena watched in stunned disbelief as the alien fleet tore through the Cathari Armada like a scythe through wheat, and the invaders tried to fight back, but their weapons seemed to pass through the newcomers without effect. And they tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. In less than an hour, the Cathari Dominion fleet was destroyed, and every single ship was reduced to expanding clouds of debris, and the skies of Earth were clear again. New ships hung in orbit like silent guardians, and Lena found herself weeping without knowing why, and her crew wept with her. And across the battered surface of Earth, survivors emerged from their hiding places and looked up at the vessels that had saved them. Then a voice spoke, and it came through every communication device on Earth, and every radio, and every screen, and every speaker, and it was a voice that seemed to contain harmonics that human ears had never heard before. "You are not alone," the voice said, and there was kindness in it and ancient wisdom. "You will survive, and this is our gift." And then the ships were gone, and they vanished into the dark between stars as quickly as they had appeared, and they left behind a species that should have been dead, and a mystery that would take generations to solve. In the weeks that followed, humanity learned who their saviors were, and they were called the Volanti Collective, and they were one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, and they had watched humanity's struggle from afar, and they had chosen to intervene. No one knew why, and the Volanti asked for nothing in return, and they offered no treaties or alliances or demands, and they simply gave their gift and disappeared. God, they left something behind. And on the dark side of the moon, human explorers found fragments of Volanti technology, and these scraps and pieces were beyond anything Earth scientists had ever imagined, and they contained secrets that would propel humanity forward by centuries. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt, and they buried their dead, and mourned their losses. And then they began to grow, and the Velanthi technology helped them reach Mars, and then the outer planets, and then the nearest stars within 100 years. Humans had colonized a dozen worlds, and within 200, they had joined the Galactic Assembly as a recognized species, and within 300, they had become a power that could not be ignored, but they never forgot what the Velanthi had done for them, and every human child learned the story of the day Earth almost died, and the day the Velanthi saved them, and every year on the anniversary of their salvation, all of humanity observed a moment of silence. They built monuments on every world they settled, and these monuments showed Velanthi ships descending from the stars, and they served as reminders that humanity existed only because of the kindness of strangers Captain Daniel Hayes had grown up with. These stories, and he had visited the monuments and observed the silences, and he had always wondered what it would be like to meet a Velanthi, and to thank them for the gift his ancestors had received. He was 43 years old, and he commanded the Starship Endeavor, and he had served in the United Earth Fleet for 20 years, and he thought he understood what it meant to be human. But, standing on the bridge of his ship at the edge of Velanthi space, and watching the distress signal pulse across his screens, he realized that understanding and knowing were very different things. "Captain," his communications officer said, and her name was Amy Porter, and her face was pale with shock. "The signal is authentic, and the Velanthi homeworld is under attack." Daniel stared at the tactical display, and it showed a fleet of enemy ships surrounding the Velanthi system, and there were thousands of them, and they were systematically destroying everything in their path. "Who are they?" he asked. "Unknown designation, and they call themselves the Vorn Imperium, and we have no prior contact with them." Daniel watched the battle unfold on his screens, and he saw Velanthi ships fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, and he saw them dying one by one, and he knew that without help the Velanthi would be destroyed. He thought about the stories he had grown up with, and he thought about the monuments and the silences, and he thought about what his species owed to the civilization that was now dying before his eyes. "Get me Admiral Cortez," he said, and his voice was quiet but firm. "Tell her we need every ship we have." Amy hesitated for just a moment, and then she nodded, and her fingers flew across her console, and the message went out across the stars. 300 years ago, the Velanthi had saved humanity, and now humanity had a chance to repay that debt, and Daniel Hayes knew in his heart that there was only one answer his species could give. The galaxy was about to learn what humans were made of. Admiral Patricia Cortez had commanded the United Earth Fleet for 11 years, and she had seen things that would break most people, but she had never felt the weight of command as heavily as she did now. She stood before the Assembly of Earth in the Great Chamber on New Geneva, and the representatives of 100 human worlds watched her with faces that held fear and uncertainty and hope. "The Velanthi are dying," she said, and her voice carried across the silent chamber. "The attacking force calls themselves the Vorn Imperium, and they emerged from the Galactic Rim approximately 50 years ago, and they have been consuming or destroying every civilization in their path." She activated the holographic display, and it showed the Velanthi system surrounded by thousands of enemy ships, and it showed the Velanthi defenders being pushed back and overwhelmed, and it showed a clock counting down to the moment when the homeworld shields would fail. "The Velanthi fleet has been reduced to less than 30% combat effectiveness," Patricia continued. "Their homeworld shields will fail within 72 hours, and when they do, an estimated 9 billion Velanthi will be killed." The chamber erupted in whispers and murmurs, and Senator Paul Grant raised his hand for silence. And he was the eldest member of the Assembly, and his voice still carried authority. "Admiral, what are you proposing?" Patricia met his gaze without hesitation, and she had known this moment would come, and she had prepared for it her entire career. "I am proposing that we honor our dead," she said. "The Velanthi saved us when we were helpless, and they asked for nothing, and they expected nothing. But we remember what they did. and we have never forgotten." She turned to address the full assembly, and her eyes moved across the faces of men and women who held the fate of humanity in their hands. "I am requesting authorization to mobilize the entire United Earth fleet, and I mean every combat-capable vessel, and every reservist, and every allied force that will stand with us, and I am asking for permission to go to war." The silence that followed was so complete that Patricia could hear her own heartbeat. Senator Grant spoke slowly and carefully, and his words seemed to cost him great effort. "Admiral, the Vorn Imperium fleet outnumbers our entire military by a factor of 3, and the Galactic Assembly has already voted against intervention, and if we act alone, we will be fighting without support against an enemy that has already crippled the most advanced civilization in known space." "Yes, sir." "You understand that this could mean the end of humanity, and that we could be walking into our own extinction?" Patricia nodded, and she thought about her daughter on Mars and her grandchildren who had never known a galaxy without peace, and she thought about what she was asking her species to sacrifice. "I understand," she said. "But 300 years ago, the Volanti looked at a dying species and decided that we were worth saving, and they risked nothing because they were powerful beyond measure. But they saved us anyway because it was right." She paused and let her words settle over the assembly like a blanket of snow. "If we turn away now, and if we let the Volanti die while we hide behind our borders, then we prove that we were never worth saving in the first place, and every monument we built becomes a lie, and every moment of silence becomes a joke, and every story we told our children becomes worthless." Her voice grew stronger, and she felt the conviction burning in her chest like a fire that could not be extinguished. "I would rather die proving we deserved their gift than live knowing we betrayed it." The vote was unanimous, and every representative raised their hand in favor, and some of them were weeping, and some of them were terrified, but all of them knew that there was only one choice they could make. Within 48 hours, the United Earth Fleet began its fastest mobilization in history, and across 100 worlds humans answered the call. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Blake stood on the observation deck of the carrier Resilience and watched the fleet assembling in orbit above New Geneva. And she had served in the Navy for 12 years, and she had never seen anything like this. Ships arrived from every corner of human space, and battleships and cruisers and destroyers and frigates and thousands of smaller craft, and they formed a constellation of steel and determination that stretched across the stars. Commanding Officer Captain Marcus Cole stood beside her, and his face was grim, but his eyes held a light that Sophie had never seen before. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. "It is everything we have," Marcus replied. "Every ship, and every soldier, and every weapon. And if we fail, there is nothing left to defend human space." Sophie watched a squadron of fighters perform a formation exercise, and she thought about her parents on Earth and her sister on Luna, and she wondered if she would ever see them again. "Do you think we can win?" she asked. Marcus was silent for a long moment, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression was one of absolute certainty. "I think we can try," he said, "and I think that is what matters." Across the fleet, similar conversations were happening, and soldiers and sailors and pilots were saying goodbye to their families and writing letters that might never be sent and preparing themselves for what lay ahead. Admiral Cortez stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Constellation, and she watched the fleet complete its assembly, and she felt the weight of every life that was about to be placed in her hands. Tactical Officer Lieutenant Kevin Drake approached her with a data pad, and his young face was serious. "Admiral, the fleet is ready," he said. "We have assembled 4,200 combat vessels and approximately 3 million personnel, and we can depart on your order." Patricia took the data pad and looked at the numbers, and each one represented a human being who had chosen to follow her into what might be certain death. "Have we received any response from the Galactic Assembly?" she asked. No, ma'am, and the Assembly has maintained its position of non-intervention, and we will be acting alone. Patricia nodded, and she had expected nothing less, and the galaxy had always been a place where species looked out for themselves. And the idea of sacrifice for others was considered foolish, but humans were not like other species, and they remembered their debts, and they paid them in full. Signal all ships, she said, and her voice was calm and steady. We depart in 1 hour, and our destination is the Volanti homeworld, and our mission is to repay a debt that is 300 years old. The signal went out, and across the fleet humans prepared for the jump, and they checked their weapons and said their prayers and steeled themselves for what was to come. 1 hour later, the United Earth Fleet vanished into hyperspace, and the largest military operation in human history was underway. The Volanti had saved humanity once, and now humanity was going to return the favor no matter what it cost. The Vorn Imperium had conquered 17 civilizations in 50 years, and they had never encountered an enemy they could not break. They had studied the Galactic Assembly and its politics, and they had learned that the member species were divided and self-interested and unwilling to sacrifice for one another. And when the Vorn began their expansion, the Assembly had debated and discussed and ultimately done nothing. The Volanti were supposed to be their greatest prize and the oldest civilization in known space would fall before the Vorn war machine, and the galaxy would see that no one was safe and resistance was pointless. Humans were an afterthought, and a young species barely emerged from their home system, and they posed no threat to the Imperium's plans. The Vorn learned their mistake when the United Earth Fleet emerged from hyperspace directly into the heart of the battle zone. Admiral Cortez had positioned her forces for maximum impact, and the human ships arrived in a coordinated wave with weapons already powered and targeting systems locked onto Vorn positions, and in the first 60 seconds of engagement 300 Vorn vessels exploded into debris on the bridge of the constellation. Patricia watched the chaos unfold with cold satisfaction, and she felt no joy in the destruction, only grim determination. All ships execute pattern Delta, she ordered. Focus fire on their command vessels and give the Volanti time to regroup. The battle became a storm of light and fire, and human ships fought with a ferocity that stunned both the Vorn and the remaining Volanti defenders. And where the Volanti fought with precision and ancient grace, humans fought with raw determination and desperate courage. Captain Daniel Hayes led his task force directly into the path of a Vorn assault group that was heading for the Volanti homeworld, and the Endeavor took crippling damage in the first exchange, but Daniel refused to withdraw. His helmsman, Lieutenant Tom Bradley, shouted over the sound of explosions and the screaming of wounded metal. "Captain, we have lost main propulsion, and we have hull breaches on decks 7 through 12, and we cannot maintain this position." Daniel gripped the arms of his command chair, and through the viewport he could see the Volanti homeworld, and it was blue and green and beautiful, and it reminded him of pictures he had seen of Earth before the Kethari came. 9 billion lives were behind him, and a debt that was 300 years old, and he knew what he had to do. "Then we hold position without propulsion," he said, and his voice was calm. "Divert all remaining power to weapons and shields, and we are not moving." The Endeavor became a bleeding barrier, and she absorbed fire that would have reached the planet below, and her crew fought with everything they had, even as their ship died around them. For 3 hours the Endeavor held her position, and in those 3 hours she destroyed 19 enemy vessels and prevented the bombardment of the Volanti northern continent. When a Vorn warship finally broke through her defenses and tore the Endeavor apart, Daniel Hayes was still sitting in his command chair, and his last thought was of the debt that his ship had helped to repay. There were no survivors across the battle space. Similar sacrifices were unfolding, and human ships threw themselves against the enemy with a courage that defied logic. The destroyer Valor rammed a Vorn carrier that was deploying ground assault troops, and the collision destroyed both vessels, but it saved 100,000 Volanti civilians who had been evacuating the target zone. The cruiser Defiance positioned herself between the Volante refugee fleet and pursuing Vorn destroyers, and Captain Lisa Morgan fought until her reactor went critical, and her final transmission was a simple message that echoed across the fleet. "Tell them we remembered." The Vorn commanders were confused and angry, and they had never seen anything like this before, and every other species they had fought had eventually calculated the cost and retreated, but the humans kept coming. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Blake found herself in command of the Resilience after Captain Marcus Cole was killed in a direct hit on the bridge, and she had no time to mourn and no time to doubt herself. The carrier was damaged and bleeding atmosphere and crew, but her fighter wings were still operational, and Sophie knew what she had to do. "All squadrons, this is Acting Captain Blake," she said, and her voice was steady despite the chaos around her. "We are going to punch a hole through their right flank and the Volante. Heavy cruisers need an opening to reach their orbital defense platforms, and we are going to give them one." Her fighters launched into the teeth of the Vorn formation, and they were outnumbered and outgunned and flying damaged craft on emergency power, but they pressed forward anyway. Sophie watched her pilots die one by one, and their signals went down on her tactical display like candles being snuffed, and she felt each loss like a knife in her heart. But she also watched the Vorn line begin to fracture, gap forming in Sector 7. Her tactical officer reported, and his voice cracked with exhaustion and hope. "The Volante are moving through." Sophie allowed herself a single moment of relief before returning her attention to the battle, and the gap would only last minutes. And they needed to hold it open. Resilience moving to support position. She ordered, "All remaining fighters cover our advance." The carrier lurched forward with engines screaming in protest, and Sophie gripped her console as the ship shuddered under Vorn fire, and warning lights cascaded across her display's hull. Integrity was dropping, and weapon systems were failing, and life support was compromised on multiple decks. But the Volante cruisers were through. Sophie watched as the orbital defense platforms came back online, and their ancient weapons carved through Vorn ships with devastating precision, and the tide was beginning to turn. But the cost was terrible, and everywhere Sophie looked, she saw human ships burning and human lives ending, and she wondered how many more would have to die before this was over. A Vorn battleship turned its attention to the Resilience, and Sophie knew that her damaged carrier could not survive another direct assault. "All hands brace for impact," she said. The Vorn ship opened fire, and the world became light and pain, and Sophie felt the deck heave beneath her feet, and she heard screams and explosions, and the terrible sound of metal tearing. When her vision cleared, she was on the floor, and her console was sparking, and half her bridge crew was dead or wounded, but the Resilience was still flying, and the orbital platforms were still firing, and the Volante were still alive. Sophie pulled herself to her feet and wiped blood from her eyes, and looked at the tactical display, and she saw that the Vorn formation was breaking apart. "Damage report?" she demanded. "We have lost 40% of our hull integrity, and main weapons are offline, but we are still operational." Sophie nodded, and she felt a fierce pride burning in her chest, and her ship and her crew had done the impossible. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since they had arrived, Sophie allowed herself to believe that they might actually win. The battle lasted 9 days, and each day brought new horrors and new sacrifices, and new reasons to believe that humanity would not survive. By the third day, the United Earth Fleet had lost 40% of its combat vessels, and Admiral Cortez had moved her flag twice as successive flagships were destroyed around her, and she had refused evacuation both times and remained on damaged bridges. Until the last possible moment, the Vorn had expected the humans to break and every other species they had faced, and eventually calculated the cost and retreated, but the humans showed no sign of stopping. By the 5th day, human losses had reached 60%, and the fleet was running low on ammunition and fuel and medical supplies, but reinforcements kept arriving from distant human colony ships, jumped in alone or in small groups, and they were merchant vessels hastily armed and mining ships, converted for combat, and passenger liners carrying volunteer soldiers, and they threw themselves into the battle without hesitation. Lieutenant Kevin Drake approached Admiral Cortez on the bridge of her third flagship, the damaged battleship Indomitable, and his face was gray with exhaustion. "Admiral, we are receiving reports of civilian ships joining the battle," he said. "They have no military training and they are dying by the hundreds." Patricia watched the tactical display, and she could see the civilian vessels fighting alongside her warships, and she could see them being destroyed one by one. "They know what they are doing," she said quietly. "They know the cost, and they are paying it anyway. But Admiral, they are civilians, and we should order them to withdraw." Patricia turned to look at Kevin, and her eyes were filled with a sorrow that seemed to have no bottom. "They are humans," she said, "and they remember their debt, and no order I give will make them turn away." By the seventh day, the Vorn fleet had been reduced by half, and their command structure was in chaos, and their confidence was shattered by an enemy that seemed incapable of surrender. The Vorn's supreme commander, Kethrak, stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his empire's greatest fleet being torn apart by a species that should have been nothing more than a footnote in history. Why do they not stop? He demanded of his officers. Why do they keep fighting when they have already lost so much? None of his officers had an answer, and the Vorn had never encountered anything like this before, and they did not understand what they were facing on. The ninth day, the Vorn Imperium fleet broke. It was not a coordinated retreat, and it was not a strategic withdrawal, and it was a rout. And Vorn ships fled in every direction, and pursued by human and Volanti forces, they scattered into the void. Admiral Cortez stood on the bridge of her fourth flagship, the hastily promoted cruiser Resolution, and she watched the Vorn retreat, and she felt no triumph, only a terrible exhaustion. Her uniform was torn and blood-stained, and she had not slept in 3 days, and around her the surviving crew worked in silence. "Admiral," our communications officer said, and his voice cracked with emotion, "we are receiving a transmission from the Volanti flagship." Patricia nodded, and the view screen flickered to life and revealed the face of a Volantithi, were humanoid but taller and thinner, and their skin was a pale blue that seemed to shimmer, and their eyes were large and silver, and they held an expression that Patricia recognized despite the alien features, gratitude and something deeper and older than gratitude. "Admiral Patricia Cortez of the United Earth Fleet," the Volanti said, and their voice contained harmonics that human ears had never heard before. "I am First Speaker Kilos of the Volanti Collective, and on behalf of my people and on behalf of every life you have saved, I wish to express our thanks." Patricia shook her head slowly, and she felt tears running down her face, and she did not try to stop them. "We were repaying a debt, First Speaker," she said. 300 years ago your people saved ours, and we remember." There was silence from the Volanti, and when Kilo spoke again, there was wonder in their voice. "We did not expect this, and we gave our gift freely with no thought of return. And we have watched your species grow and prosper, and we were content knowing that our intervention had allowed you to survive, and we never imagined that you would come for us in our hour of need. Then you underestimated us." Patricia said quietly, "We are human, and we remember our debts, and we pay them in full." The transmission ended, and Patricia turned away from the view screen and looked out at the debris field that stretched across the stars. Human ships and Vorn ships and Volanti ships, all reduced to scattered wreckage, and the silence of space filled with the ghosts of millions who had died. Captain Sophie Blake, now confirmed as captain of the limping Resilience, approached her, and Sophie's face was bruised, and her arm was in a sling, but her eyes were clear. "Admiral, the casualty reports are coming in," she said. "We lost over 2 million personnel, and 70% of our fleet is destroyed or damaged beyond repair." Patricia closed her eyes, and 2 million lives, and fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, and all of them gone. "And the Volanthe?" she asked. "Their homeworld is secure, and civilian casualties were minimal, and they estimate that we saved over 8 billion lives. 8 billion against 2 million, and the mathematics were simple. But mathematics had never been what this was about. It was worth it," Patricia said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Every life we lost and every ship we sacrificed, and it was worth it." Sophie nodded, and her eyes were wet with tears, but she stood tall. "Yes, Admiral, it was. Across the battle space, the survivors began the long process of rescue and recovery, and human and Volanthe ships worked side by side to save the wounded and recover the dead. The war was over and the debt was paid, and humanity had proven something that the galaxy would never forget." The aftermath of the Battle of Volanthe Prime echoed across the galaxy like thunder rolling through mountains that had never known sound. The Galactic Assembly, which had refused to intervene, found itself facing questions it could not answer, and species that had remained neutral watched the recordings of human ships throwing themselves against impossible odds and dying by the millions to save a people they owed no alliance to. The Vorn Imperium, broken and scattered, would never recover, and their surviving leaders attempted to negotiate peace, but found no sympathy among the Assembly members who had once feared them, and within a decade, the Imperium would collapse entirely. But it was the relationship between humanity and the Volanthe that changed most profoundly. First speaker Kilos traveled to Earth 3 months after the battle, and she was the first Volanthe to visit the human homeworld since the day her people had saved it 300 years before. She stood before the monument to salvation, and it was a great structure that humans had built to remember their rescue. And she looked at the carved images of Volanthe ships descending from the stars, and she wept openly. 300 years. She said to the assembled crowd that had gathered to witness this moment, "For 300 years we wondered if we had made the right choice, and the Volanthe have saved many species from extinction over our long history, and some proved worthy of the gift, but many did not." She turned to face the human delegation led by Admiral Cortez and the surviving commanders of the Earth fleet. "But you have shown us something we have never seen before," Kilos continued, and her voice carried across the silent crowd. "You did not simply survive, and you did not simply prosper, and you remembered, and you honored a gift given without expectation of return, and when the moment came you sacrificed everything you had to repay a debt that we never asked you to acknowledge." She placed her hand over her heart, and it was a Volanthe gesture of deepest respect. "The Volanthe Collective has existed for 100,000 years, and we have seen empires rise and fall, and species evolve and go extinct, and stars born and die. And in all that time, we have never witnessed anything like what humanity did at Volanthe Prime." Admiral Cortez stepped forward, and she had recovered some of her strength in the months since the battle, but the weight of what she had seen and done would never leave her. "We did not do it for reward," she said, "and we did not do it for alliance or advantage, and we did it because it was right, and because you saved us when you did not have to, and we could not let you fall when we had the power to help." Kilos nodded, and when she spoke again, her words seemed to carry the weight of 100,000 years. "From this day forward, humans and Volanthe are not simply allies, and we are family. And where you go, we go, and where you stand, we stand, and your enemies are our enemies, and your triumphs are our triumphs. And until the last star burns out, the Volanthe will remember what humanity did for us." The crowd was silent, and the moment seemed to stretch into eternity. In the years that followed, the human Volanthe alliance became the foundation of a new order in the galaxy, and species that had dismissed humanity as young and unimportant found themselves dealing with a civilization that had proven something remarkable. Honor was not merely a word, and debts could be paid across centuries, and the smallest acts of kindness could echo through generations. The Galactic Assembly reformed, and its members slowly learned that neutrality was not always wisdom, and that standing apart while others suffered was not always the right choice. Admiral Sophie Blake spent the rest of her career building bridges between species, and she established the first multi-species academy where young officers from dozens of civilizations trained together and learned not just tactics and strategy, but history and philosophy. Remember, she would tell each graduating class, and her voice would carry across the assembled students. The galaxy is watching, and they are always watching, and they are waiting to see what kind of species we really are, and what kind of people we choose to be, and never give them reason to doubt, and never give them reason to forget. Patricia Cortez lived to be 107 years old, and she spent her final years writing her memoirs, and her book became required reading in schools across human space and eventually across the galaxy. In her final chapter, she wrote words that would be quoted for thousands of years. I've been asked many times if the sacrifice was worth it, and 2 million humans died to save the Volante, and the mathematics suggests we saved 4,000 lives for every life we lost. But that was never the calculation we made. We went to Volante Prime because we owed a debt, and we stayed because we are human. And when the battle was over, and the Vorn were broken, and the Volante were saved, we stood in the silence of space and knew that we had proven something important, not to the galaxy and not to the Volante, but to ourselves. We are worthy of the gift that was given to us, and we are worthy of the future that was purchased with alien blood 300 years ago. And whatever challenges lie ahead, and whatever enemies rise against us, and whatever test the universe presents, we will face them knowing that we have earned our place among the stars. The Volante saved us, and we saved them in return, and the debt is paid, but the bond it created will last forever, and the galaxy can only stand in stillness and wonder at what we have become. On every human world and on every Volante world, monuments were built to commemorate what had happened, and these monuments showed human and Volante ships fighting side by side, and they served as reminders of what two species could achieve when they chose to honor their fleas, obligations, and when travelers from distant stars visited these monuments, they would ask about the story behind them, and they would be told about a young species that remembered a gift given 300 years before, and about a sacrifice that changed the galaxy forever. The travelers would stand in silence, and they would understand why the galaxy had watched in stillness as humanity proved what they were truly made of. The debt was paid, and the bond was forged, and the story would never be forgotten. This was the legacy of humanity, and this was the gift they gave to the future, and this was why the galaxy would remember them forever. The end.